This episode of the podcast is different than usual. The main motivation of the show is to search out ideas and individuals who I think have new and insightful things to say about how landscapes are shaped or how they ought to be shaped. This episode is featuring neither a new idea nor something I find that insightful. But the theory of change showcased today, while I think is flawed, is incredibly powerful. The idea of sustainable intensification as a food system solution has kicked around for decades. Every student of the food system encounters both misty-eyed reverence for the Green Revolution, as well as tireless environmental histories that show how Norman Borlaug's innovation-driven campaign to install monocultures worldwide was neither green nor revolutionary. For some, the evidence of yield expansion under new regimes of agricultural modernization spared untold forests from hungry peasants exploiting the land and saved 1 billion lives from abject hunger. For others, like Glenn Davis Stone, author of The Agricultural Dilemma, summarizing his investigation of the Green Revolution policies, writes, "The new histories lead us to revise the number of lives saved from 1 billion to a lower number, like 0. So when Michael Grunwald published an article in the New York Times with the title, "Factory Farms Are Our Best Hope for Feeding the Planet," I read the article expecting for there to be some kind of new information that would motivate such a confident vision for sustainable food. In my opinion, there was nothing new. It was simply Green Revolution 2.0. Grunwald's new book, We Are Eating the Earth, doubles down, writing in the introduction, "This idea that making more food per acre reduces the pressure to clear more acres to make food, originally known as the Borlaug hypothesis, now usually called sustainable intensification, is central to this book." And so when Grunwald's book appears to be having popular appeal, being showcased on The Daily Show, numerous positive reviews, and many shortlists, that raises an important question. What's interesting to me here is why this idea never goes away. How does it end up enrolling what we assume is a neutral environmental journalist into its logic and advocating for its adoption? I do think that's a question worth engaging with. For me, sustainable intensification, propped up by a Green Revolution-style argument, just has so many red flags that we shouldn't take it at face value. Just as I would be suspicious of any moral that centers a wondrous parable for how one man from the global north changed the world with technological supremacy, the hype of techno-driven sustainability achieved through individual talent is no different. Max Eil, in A People's Green New Deal, is also skeptical of this type of eco-modernist solution-making. He asks, can everything stay the same while everything changes? The discourse of technological progress is the siren of industrial and post-industrial capitalism, distracting from political conflict over who gets what, while placing politics beyond the reach of the common person. Sustainable intensification, where nothing really needs to change about the politics of the food system to get us to sustainability, is what Eil calls, quote, a sweet but perilous song. And so after I penned some responses to Grunwald's writing, he suggested we hash it out in person rather than over dueling op-eds. But that does raise a challenge for how I normally do this podcast. I always send my questions to my hosts ahead of time. I'm not interested in, nor really skilled at, gotcha moments or Jubilee-style debates. I know that Grunwald is rather entrenched in his stance and would deliver many arguments that I simply would not be able to counter in pursuit of my larger goal, which is finding out the values behind the belief in the sustainable intensification worldview. So what I hope you take away, which I certainly did, is not the entertaining debating of the facts of the case, although there is some of that, but the attempt to understand the deeper principles that shape one's understanding of what counts as a sustainable food system. And while I think I struggled sometimes in getting past the talking points, you will hear appeals to laws of supply and demand, to accounting, to the power of price mechanisms, virtues of efficiency, the promise of modernity, and yes, a one-sided retelling of the Green Revolution. It's those value-laden foundations that possess the power to reproduce faith in the idea of sustainable intensification, and of course, thus powers policymakers and farmers to turn those ideas into practice. I'm Adam Calo, and you're listening to Landscapes. Mike Grunwald, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to try and set the goals for this conversation. I've read your book and a lot of your recent food reporting. I've written a blog and a kind of lengthy article rebutting some of the main claims that you made so
Yeah,
far.
yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah, the blog was snarky, but the other article was longer and tried to connect it to other issues, and so that you're not the only target here. And it's clear that we see pathways to sustainable food differently. But you also, reached out and you said that you are genuinely trying to understand this stuff, and I sense that in your book. And so, in that spirit, instead of trying to kind of confront you with an in-person debunking, my hope is that we think together through some of these thorny issues. What do you think?
I'll try to be more useful and less idiot.
Okay. Well, as a shortcut, I'm going to try and summarize the main argument of your book as strongly as I can, so that you don't have to explain it, and then you can kind of correct me what I got wrong. And then after that, I'll dive into some of the key assumptions that I think would be interesting to explore in more depth.
Sure.
The main argument of the book, as I see it, is that if we really want to get serious about agriculture's impact on the climate, we have to do a much better accounting of how any change in agricultural production is influencing forested land or other really important lands elsewhere. And this key insight is born out of this character study from Tim Searchinger, head of the WRI, the World Resources Institute, that really started with thinking about biofuels from that accounting perspective and says, wait a second, if we drastically alter productive lands towards biofuel crops, and that ends up driving demand for crop fuels in the tropics that leads to deforestation, we can no longer claim that biofuels acts as a climate solution. And then that insight is taken forward to say that anytime we have some kind of production decision, we have to think beyond the boundaries of what's happening on the individual farm. And in this case, it says sustainability is achieved through producing more food on less land because of land use conversion to agriculture. That's the real climate and nature destroyer. As I saw you wrote elsewhere, you said that your book is a narrative about life cycle accounting of indirect land use change. Very exciting, right?
Look, I think you sort of focused on the kind of production side of, to the extent there's an argument to the book, and I think that's fair. I guess the overarching idea is that land matters. And as you said, it's not just the land right in front of you, but global land, this idea that agriculture is eating the earth, right? That is the biggest environmental problem on our planet, is this idea that we're losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. That agriculture now covers a landmass the size of all of Asia plus all of Europe. And that essentially, both on the demand and supply side, it's going to be really important for us to reduce our demand for land and at the same time that we, basically increase the supply of food to feed people. So yeah, on the supply side, definitely I'm sort of focusing us on this idea that the true environmental disaster of agriculture is the fact that it is taking over the world.
I guess this is the main point of contention where then therefore in the book it appears that the true environmental solution is this sustainable intensification narrative. And when you apply that in the book, which is one of the best parts of the book where you can then kind of go through these different food system solutions with this lens, it allows you to evaluate some of them. And in my read of the book, you kind of come away with the only ones that are really going to work are the ones that have this ability to intensify without being as disastrous as whatever came before it.
Possibly. I mean, remember that's on the supply side. That's generally true. I think on the demand side, right? Like if everybody in the world went vegan tomorrow, which is something that I don't think is going to happen, but that would solve a lot of these problems because it would dramatically reduce our demand for land. Or even if just everybody who ate beef decided to eat chicken instead, that would suck for the chickens, but that would dramatically reduce our demand for land. But then on the supply side, yes, I do focus a lot on this idea that we need to make more food with less land and less mess, fewer emissions, and that often involves the kind of some kind of sustainable intensification.
So let's look at this supply side argument. I think one of my contentions is that these demand and supply are interrelated. So we have to be thinking about them together. But let's just focus on the supply because this argument of sustainable intensification really relies on two key assumptions. The first is that increasing production addresses hunger. And then the second is that increasing production will result in a climate or biodiversity positive land use change. So, to start, convince me that increasing commodity production is the way to reduce hunger in the world.
Well, I guess what I would convince you is that you can't without it. Right? I think and not to pick on you, but I think a lot of the critiques from the sort of, regenerative, organic, um, sort of low yield agriculture arguments have sort of hand waved away this idea that sustainable intensification matters or is even possible by just pointing out like, well, we've done a lot of industrial agriculture, we've done a lot of intensification, and there's still deforestation, or there's a rebound effect. And I'm not denying any of that. I think this is, as I say in the book, this is a really wicked problem. It's a really hard problem. But I will say is that, we're going to have, depending on, we're going to have a couple billion more people, certainly on in 2050 than we did when I started working on this book. Right now the projections are for them to demand for meat to increase about 70%, which is going to dramatically increase the demand for land. So we're not going to solve these problems without more food. Now, you are suggesting that just increasing production and having more calories out there is not going to solve the problem. And I'm not going to fight you on that. um, it's true. It's harder than that. But I will say we won't be able to feed people if there isn't enough food.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I just think that it's not about hand waving away that food availability is important. It's just that we have good evidence that national food availability is, in general, a minority part of the drivers of food insecurity. And so to be focusing on that so intensely and then saying, wow, it's a wicked, wicked problem, hunger is a wicked problem, it's like, well, if we think about our food system sustainability solution with knowing what addresses hunger, then maybe we shouldn't be just focusing on commodity production.
Well, this is a good actually, maybe we should drill down a little bit more, because I don't wanna get too deep into the weeds, but I think the main when we talk about, like, what makes people hungry, I mean, I would think and this again, this is what we're wildly oversimplifying for all this stuff because there are 8 billion people and quadrillions of calories of food, but in generally, it's sort of, food shortages and food there's not enough food and food is too expensive. Those are the 2 biggest, or at least without fixing those problems, people are gonna be hungry. There are other problems too, but those are really important problems, and those are both solved by making shit tons of food, right? In the same way, we've seen some of this argument with housing, where people point to a lot of different problems of, why housing has become unaffordable or out of the in reach of the middle class in the United States. But in general, the most important thing is you got to build more housing, and then the price goes down. That's kind of basic economics. And as we've seen with all basic economics, the world is not this, profit maximizing, Homo economicus, you know, automaton thing where, this guy makes more food and instantly the price goes down around the world and people who are living on a dollar or two a day in sub-Saharan Africa are instantly, able to afford as much food as they want. But I think it's going to be really hard to feed the poorest of the poor unless food is cheap and food is plentiful. And they are both solved by making lots of food.
You'd be surprised that I don't think that increasing market rate housing is the key to solving the housing crisis. But I think I'm just going to make one more pushback. That is, if you look at the data, analysis of how food availability influences something like childhood stunting. It's things like access to safe water, sanitation capacity, gender equity. These are stronger determinants of addressing food security than food availability. Let me just try
You're
and
talking about poverty. I mean, you're talking about the poorest places in the world. Those are the places that don't have those are the places that don't have clean water. Those are the places that that have, the highest infant mortality. These are the places with all of these problems. And so a big part of the answer is to make them less poor and to make food more affordable. And those are the kind of, you want to increase the supply and reduce the price.
1 in 8 on SNAP in the US, right? Is it because we don't have enough food available?
In the United States, I mean, when I'm talking about feeding the world, I mean, in the United States, it's mostly fed. And there, I think, there, I agree that that's not that when I talk about how, we need to feed the world without frying the world, um, you know, I'm much more talking about sub-Saharan Africa than I am talking about the United States, where I agree there's plenty of food.
So the people who are on SNAP.
In fact, in the United States, we do a really good job of producing food efficiently.
All right. Well, let me think about this in terms of one of the examples from your book. You have a corn farmer whose last name is Rice, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and he says, in the book, we feel a responsibility to feed the world. If rice increases their production, who are they feeding? Where is Rice's corn going?
Well, I mean, and this is a somewhat different discussion, but I mean, I bet on some of this stuff we're going to wildly agree. So him in particular, or if you describe him as the typical U.S. corn farmer, about 40% of it is going to go to ethanol, to somebody's SUV, which, as you know, I think is like a epic environmental catastrophe.
Yes.
And I think maybe we agree on that. But I would also point out that and the reason it's a catastrophe is because ethanol is eating the earth. Ethanol is eating about a Texas worth of the earth, while agriculture is eating 75 Texas's worth of the earth. So it's not the biggest problem, but in the United States, that's where we're pissing away 40% of his crop. And then another 40% about is going to livestock. And that's why I do focus a lot on these demand side issues as well. And only, maybe 20% in some areas less is going to actually, the kind of whether the food, whether it's like kind of the tortillas or that corn farmers like to talk about, or whether it's Doritos, the kind of empty calories. But yeah, but a lot of it is going to me, is being laundered and through animals into meat, and then some of it is going into food, and some of it is going into fuel. But if again, the those demand side things I think we should put aside. The idea is that, to the extent that we have enough in the United States, we can export more to the rest of the world, and hopefully they will use it for food calories that'll help feed people.
I think when I was reading that section on rice, what I thought about it was you are holding up the farmer's commitment to efficiency as a model for sustainable intensification. But when we think about that contribution to does that intensification actually address hunger? To me, when you describe where this corn goes to Doritos, to maybe some meat, to ethanol, right? Then I don't think that this is contributing to feeding, the people who need to be fed.
I think what you're saying, but I mean, in a way, you're kind of making an anyway error, right? That I describe in the book, right? You're saying like, well, we shouldn't, we need to look at this differently because that corn shouldn't go to biofuels. And there we agree. But okay, let's imagine that none of it went to biofuels. You would still want it to be more efficient, right? You don't want to, we need to do that anyway. It's not like you can't say like, okay, if we, if we didn't have to use all that land for biofuels, well, then we could grow corn really inefficiently. I mean, we should grow corn efficiently and we shouldn't use biofuels. Like those both of those changes would contribute to us making more food with less land.
I think the more kind of basic point that I make here with regards of the feeding people side of it is when you increase yields, I think that the evidence strongly shows that you might be able to address hunger, you might have no effect on hunger, and you might actually exacerbate hunger by displacing people's economic livelihoods. And that each case is important to understand rather than this blanket, all efficiency is good, all intensification is good.
Well, no, I think at the margin, yeah, the efficiency at the margin, again, efficiency is going to be good. And that includes for people in the, developing smallholder farmers in the developing world who are often kind of like valorized in these discussions, but are some of the poorest people on earth. And they desperately need more efficiency. This idea that, it's what I heard again and again at Climate Week, where I'd go to these events where and there would always be some, regenerative chef talking about how food needs to be more expensive, and some, you know, organic farmer kind of making similar arguments. No, I think food needs to be plentiful and farming needs to be more efficient. And then we should leave the land that we don't need for farming, to nature when we can, wherever that is.
Yeah, I think we'll get to the challenges of the good food movement a little bit later. I think one of the themes here that I'm reflecting on your book, it feels like when we talk about farmers want efficiency, I think that's a means and ends confusion, right? So I would argue that at least the farmers I talk to, they want economic security, they want a good quality of life. They just don't necessarily want efficiency. That might be a means, but if it's not, then I think that we shouldn't always hold efficiency as a universal good. Let me jump to another question that I had, which is that you have this UC Davis scientist, Ben Eneman.
Oh yeah, the biotech woman.
They say efficiency is sustainability. That's fundamental. Is that something that you agree with?
I I think at the margins, it moves that yes, I think it's more sustainable than inefficiency. That doesn't mean look, I think a lot of people have taken that to mean like, oh, he hates regenerative agriculture or and my feeling is, you know, high efficiency regenerative agriculture is way better than low efficiency regenerative agriculture. And as I wrote in the book, like, I saw in Brazil, there's some farmers and ranchers using regenerative practices and having incredible yields, and I think that's awesome. But at the margins, yeah, I think, if the question is just do you wanna be more efficient or less efficient? Yeah, more efficient is more sustainable. As I'm sure you'll point out and we will discuss, like, if more efficiency requires, using tons more fertilizer that all ends up in the river, that could end up being worse. But in general, more efficiency would mean more of that fertilizer ends up in the crop rather than the river and rather than, volatilizing into nitrous oxide. So in general, I think, yeah, more efficient farming is going to produce better environmental outcomes.
I guess I'm curious just what you think about this idea at a more philosophical level. I feel like I have a zillion apps on my phone that are making me more efficient, but I have absolutely no time, right? We have our cars are more efficient, but we have more cars on the road and our aggregate emissions are up, right? So in a general level, how do you feel about the efficiency tools that you have in this world and how they lead to sustainability or not?
It's an interesting point. I mean, you sort of raised two different examples. The second was this kind of rebound effect, right? Which is this idea that if you make food more efficiently, and I discuss this in the book, particularly, the obvious example is in Africa or in South America, where the first thing, a farmer is going to do if they can figure out a way to increase their yields, or if the government helps them, provides them with whether it's irrigation or fertilizer or, something else that can or, tractor or something else that can increase their yields, the first thing they're going to do is, basically deforest, clear more land and, so that they can make more money. And that is a kind of rebound effect that, the first thing if beef gets expensive, cattle ranchers want to want to make more money that way too. I think that is the rebound effect is a good thing to worry about, because that will take away from some of the efficiency gains. And I talk about how that has to be dealt with through policy mechanisms. The more general point that you're making about about all these different efficiencies in our life, yes, like a washing machine is more efficient than washing laundry by hand. But has that really, and that was seen back in the 50s as this was going to be this great liberating force for women. And has it really? I mean, I would say like probably if you're the person who has to use the washing machine versus washing the clothes by hand, I bet you would appreciate that efficiency. And in general, like, yeah, I do think that having the option of efficient production, that's the sort of thing that the farmers at the, who would otherwise have to do it inefficiently, and then the eaters who would have to pay the cost of inefficient production. I do think that's something that people appreciate.
Funny because I use the washing machine example when I teach this in my class. So you brought it up, and there's a great book called "More Work for Mother" that talks about indeed the character of the labor changes with this new tool for washing, but the time spent doing it increases, and because it goes through our gender relations, it becomes more women's labor than it was in the
It's
past,
an inter
and so
no, it's an interesting
yeah.
point, and yet, like, like, how many, how many people are voluntarily giving up their washing machines, right? It's, and is it the washing machine's fault, that, or is it a problem of gender relations, that is a little bit, I would say, sort of beyond the scope of of my analysis of agriculture and productivity. I wrote about a bunch of solutions for how you can make agriculture more productive and less destructive. And, some of them are really promising and some of them are less promising and none of them really have any traction yet. I didn't really write about, a lot of solutions for how we can make this a more just society, how we can make it a society that values the labor of working people. I'm sure those are important questions that I'm not sure are like my research gives me any great insight into. Maybe yours does.
I just think that they're connected, right? And of course, you don't have to do everything in one book. But I think these questions of if you are thumbing your finger on the scale of some food system solutions that might graft on to some injustice or some unintended rebound effect, then we should be able to, perhaps in a later book or with future thinking, to kind of integrate these to kind of increase that lens of analysis.
Well, what I would say about I sort of more focused on the thing itself rather than maybe the thing beyond the thing. And like, on the rebound effect, I have very specific policy, suggestions about, for instance, produce and protect, the idea that we want to tie the carrots to the sticks, that if you're going to, that part of global assistance that helps make, developing world farmers more efficient, should be tied to sticks, conditioning that money to the forest staying up. And that's really important because, as I mentioned in the book, I mean, if right now, if yields don't increase in Africa alone, Africa, just deforestation in Africa by 2050 could blow the entire world past 2 degrees warming, 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And that's even if, we all stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow. So these are like really important problems. Like the downside is really bad. If we don't do these things, you are correctly pointing out that there can be some unintended consequences to doing those things. And I've tried to sort of point out some of the ways to mitigate some of those downsides. On the fertilizer side, it's like, or just generally with big ag, what I've suggested is that we kind of want some sort of general bargain where instead of the current situation, which is just kind of like, the big guys can do whatever the hell they want, we combine hey, like we are not going to demonize you for making lots of food, however you do it, whether it's, industrially or regeneratively or some combination of those. But we are really going to be strict about making sure you don't make such of a mess. And that is hard because the political economy of that stuff is hard. But all of this stuff is hard. If it were easy, somebody would have done it already.
The downsides are bad, but let's get into the second main assumption of this argument that aims to protect forests. Because the second main assumption here is that when you intensify production, it's good for the climate and biodiversity because it reduces pressure on forested or some other richly biodiverse land elsewhere. Walk me through an example of how this works. Say that there's a monoculture soy farm that's very high yielding by your standards, and they read an article from me and they say that the pesticides are it's not making safe for their kids to swim in the local river, right? And they decide to transition their 100 acres into mixed crop production model. Maybe they plant some kernza, which you dislike. By your calculations, the yields per acre go down, and then that fixed demand for food will inevitably cause the forest to be felled to replace that lost soy. These farmers, they're like hurting the climate, right?
Pretty much. I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah, Kernza is not a climate solution because it has a third the yields of wheat. And to the extent any Kernza
Yeah,
replaces
but
wheat,
how?
you're going to have
Okay,
to
how
grow.
the
This is just basic math, right? That if you make, one third as much food per acre, you are going to need 3 times as many acres to make the same amount of food. And this is like a
Okay, that's
great,
basic math.
and like since we should mention the Green Revolution, since it's the exact same math, right? The Green Revolution since the 60s has tripled global crop and livestock yields. If we hadn't done all that stuff, we would need 3 times as much land to make the same amount of food that we're making right now. And again, it doesn't mean that every acre, every time you make an acre, you can pinpoint exactly where where that acre is being replaced. It's a global food system. But I think we can say in the same way that just as we know that the 40 million acres of corn in the United States that are going into some gas tank, we know that at some level that corn is being replaced in the food system somewhere else and is having some kind of environmental impact, even though we can argue about how much. In the same way, we know that by tripling global yields and reducing by 2/3 the amount of food we need, the amount of land we need to make a certain amount of food, we have reduced the amount of food, amount of land that we need to create food, and we've saved a bunch of forests. We can argue about exactly how many and how many people there would be on Earth if we hadn't done these and done made these innovations. And I guess which couple of billion of people we want to get rid of if you think that's been a bad thing. But I think the general point is that yeah, that's that if you make less food per acre, you need more acres to make food, and you kind of can't get around that.
With the math equation, it makes sense, but you didn't weren't able to answer my question. Was in that instance, like walk me through where a farmer somewhere else says, you know what, there's 10 acres left of
Well,
wheat
it's a
out there.
price
I'm going to cut
mechanism.
down this
It
forest.
goes through a price mechanism would be the sort of the larger. I mean, if over
But where
time,
does that farmer get the signal that
if
the price goes
if
down?
the if tomorrow they every wheat farmer in the United States decided to grow Kernza instead, there would be massive wheat shortages, right? And because suddenly the U.S. would be producing much less grain, and the mechanism would be that suddenly the wheat would become a scarcer good, and the price would go up, and farmers would say like, "Hey, at the margin, I can make more money plowing down more grasslands, or to make more wheat, or turning more of my X crop into wheat, and then they have to tear down a forest to make X crop." It's a very obviously there's a long daisy chain of this stuff, but the supply and demand, that again can't be hand waved away. There's like, and again, it's common sense. If that if you take a lot of food out of the food system that people were demanding before, there is going to be a change. There'll be a change of the price, there'll be a change of the supply, and then the demand and supply interaction will shift, and you're going to have to create more supply.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I think we can keep arguing about this, including the Green Revolution, but I think it just reveals that you kind of have a market dependency, or to be more fair, a market fundamental approach to the food system, where I would see the decisions that farmers make to be much more than about price. We went back to this housing issue too, right? There was a part in your book that I thought was illustrative here, in which you were kind of going through the rebuttals to Searchinger's biofuels claims. And one of the rebuttals you kind of waved us off as kind of too jargony, and you said it was academic gobbledygook. But I looked at the paper where you were analyzing this, and they just said, the conclusions of both papers depend, and these are the biofuels papers, on the misleading premise that biofuel production causes forests and grasslands to be converted to agriculture. However, field research, including a meta-analysis of 152 case studies, consistently finds that land use change and associated carbon emissions are driven by interactions among cultural, technological, biophysical, political, economic, and demographic forces within a spatial and temporal context rather than by a single crop market. Now, there's certainly like some academic jargon here, but if these authors are saying, hey, there are other forces that are going to determine what shapes land use and not just price, then maybe we should be curious about that.
Of course, there are going to be there are always going to be lots of forces about everybody who makes any decision. But we also know that like, you know, I mean, and some of this idea is kind of it's like sticking your hands in your ears and saying la 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 la. We're not going to think about price. We're not going to think about demand. We're not going to think about supply. Um, this is obviously going to have an effect in the same way that, the fact that we are using a Texas worth of land for biofuels, that clear, if that has an effect, we know it does. It's like it would be insane to say that it doesn't. And now it would also be insane to say that it's the only thing that matters. And I am not saying that. But at the margins, like, yeah, if we use less land for biofuels, we are going to have more land available for food, and we are not going to need as much land, much of that land, we will be able to leave more land alone for forests. And again, some of these have to do with, you can do the models and decide your elasticities and decide the price signals and decide the stickiness of farmers' planting decisions. Those are all legitimate, but we all know that when prices go up, people demand less of it, but suppliers want to make more of it. I mean, these are these are just basic things, and I understand the instinct to say like, hey, it's not all about price. That makes perfect sense to me. But this, what I hear again and again, which is this kind of like the world doesn't need more food, the price doesn't matter, none of this has any impact on farmers' decisions. That all just seems cuckoo to me.
So I think my argument to you here on the land sparing piece here is that when you intensify agriculture, at best, you are getting a really fickle friend to that goal that you have of reducing land expansion. We talked about the rebound effects, and this kind of suggests to me that if you have these two prerequisites where increasing yields are not the most important tool to address hunger, and also increasing production to stem land conversion is not always going to be the main determinant for land degradation, then to me, it doesn't make sense to focus on yield as a central factor, as the unifying factor among many in the pursuit of feeding the earth without frying it. I mean, in your New York Times tweets, you have this quote where you say, "The more grain their farms can grow for the world, the less new farmland will be need to be wrestled away from Mother Nature on the other side of the planet." It just seems way too extreme given the complexity that we've already been able to get into here.
I just think that's, I still think that's just basically true. I mean, it's and we can argue about how much, but again, like I said, like since the Green Revolution, we have tripled yields. I mean, we have, this is, and all of these, there were all these like famous bets where Paul Ehrlich said, we're going to have mass starvation, we're going to have, all these terrible, mass famines and mass malnutrition, and basically we're all going to have this horrible Malthusian situation that has not materialized because we made a lot more food. And you would have expected like us to have used like way, way, way more land. Now, in fact, we've used a lot more land, but nowhere near the amount of land that you would have expected from that massive increase in food production. And that is like, to me, that's like a great achievement. And now some people are pointing out like, yeah, but there have been some real downsides. Like, there's a dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico, and all these algal blooms in my beloved Everglades and the Great Lakes, and basically all kinds of other bad shit that's been done by industrial agriculture, and not just and just agriculture in general. And what I'm saying is like those are real problems that we need to that we should be focusing on. How can we mitigate those problems? But the idea that instead we should go back to like not making enough food, since again, we already are not making quite enough food, but we're way closer than you would have expected on our previous trajectory. I think when you look at the numbers and you say like, oh shit, we're going to have to increase yields even faster than we have over the last 60 years during the next 25 years. And we're going to have to make even more food over the next 30 years than we've made over the last 12,000 years. How can we do that without, this massive environmental catastrophe? I think, if sustainable intensification isn't at least part of your solution, you're not really taking the numbers seriously.
I think talking about the Green Revolution, all these things, all these arguments you're making really have this accounting mindset. And, you say common sense, kind of everyone knows, right? And I think my broader point here is that I think it's a big mistake to view these food system issues as an accounting issue. At one point in the book, Searchinger is doing the math about, biomass as a climate solution. And you write, quote, What really scared him, as banal as it sounds, was the accounting. He liked to say that if you want to screw the world up a little, do a bad thing. But if you want to screw up the world a lot, set up accounting rules that incentivize everyone to do the bad thing. So convince me you're not making the same mistake, that you haven't collapsed the food system into a few finite variables, price, production, okay, land area, and concluded that yield ought to be the top of the priority. And you end up incentivizing everyone to do the wrong thing, which is kind of place our hopes in the hands of agribusiness and factory farms, right? And hope that they can produce more with less.
Well, I think the hope is that whoever can produce more, and what I have heard, and it's been nice to hear, and I wrote about it in the book, is like a lot of people saying like, hey, these regenerative solutions can actually produce awesome yields. And why aren't we investing more in research to help them do that on a, at scale? And I'm all for that. Like, I think anything that can make more food with less mess and less land is definitely that's going to be part of the solution. But what Tim was talking about with accounting was this idea that the current accounting does not take land into account, and that needs to be part of our thinking. That is the real change. And I think if we had a basic accounting that sort of took into account like how much food we need and how much food we're making and how much land we're using, those are pretty important variables. And and there are other and people will point out like, well, we shouldn't waste so much food. And I'm like, hell yeah, we should not. And let's work on that. And how can we cut food waste in half? And I talk about a ton of different solutions, and that will all close these gaps that Tim talks about in his big report. This idea that we have a food gap, we have a land gap, we have an emissions gap that we all need to close. We need to, we're going to have to use less land. We have to make more food. We have to do fewer emissions. And so we should be looking at all different kinds of ways to do that. But what I'm saying is that those three gaps are real. And that has to be a prerequisite that if, to the extent that those gaps persist, those gaps translate into human and environmental damage and catastrophe. And and I think that they have to be addressed. Now, I'm trying not to be prescriptive, and I think, particularly the headline, that New York Times article, probably was more prescriptive than I would have wanted to be about how we're going to make all this food and how we can do it with less land. But I do like if you're going to call me overly simplistic about the fact that we do need more food with less land and less mess, I'll plead guilty to that.
We're making progress. I only have two more, antagonistic questions, and
All
then we'll
right.
move on here. I think let me confess, this was the hardest part of the book that I read to read. Okay, it comes from again kind of Searchinger's journey of thinking about what are real solutions once you have this mindset. And you write, quote, "It gradually dawned on him that big ag's industrial efficiency, while motivated by profits, reduced emissions by reducing demand for farmland, an unsettling challenge to his environmental worldview. At EDF, he had associated factory farms with river fouling manure pits, not forest sparing productivity. It never occurred to him, while he was litigating to keep pesticides and fertilizers out of the air in the Gulf of Mexico, that they also protected nature by boosting yields." So, I mean, I feel like there's two problems here. For one, there's the value judgment here that, protecting nature is worth pursuing more than avoiding river fouling manure pits. But second, it seems like this land sparing rhetoric, it really traps you. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that agribusiness has to be a key partner in our sustainable future rather than a key actor that has been causing, harm to our environments, to injustice, and all the rest that you know very much. It's just such a gift to actors here that are happy you're doing their work for them.
Let me those are sort of two different questions. So let me take the first one again, and I think you've probably heard me talk about this a little bit, and this may be somewhere where we really disagree, because I do think, and I'm not hand waving in a way, and in fact, I'm working on a piece about this for the Times right now, that the intensification of agriculture, from the rustic, regenerative, Michael Pollan sanctioned farms of yore, that were, I always say where the animals are, have names instead of numbers and the soil is treated with love. And the sort of intensification of those into these chemical drenched monocultures and the, sort of evil automated factory farms, where the animals are treated like widgets. there has been a real environmental cost. And the main one has been the kind of nutrient pollution that is they're making a mess. They're terrible. And they are unregulated, which is absurd. They are factory farms. They should be regulated like factories. They are dumping a lot of poop. It's animal poop. It should be regulated like human poop. People are pissed, and I'm pissed too. That said, it is true that I think there's been way more environmental damage from extensification than intensification. The fact that agriculture now uses 2 of every 5 acres of this planet. Those all used to be natural, and now they are farms and pastures. They are agricultural. That is the transformation. That is the reason that agriculture is the leading driver of water shortages, using 70% of our fresh water. That's the reason why it's the leading driver of biodiversity loss, of habitat loss, of deforestation, of wetland destruction, of the disappearance of the grasslands and the prairie, all those bad things. It really is the fact that like we have this massive agricultural footprint. And so yeah, that I do think that is the main focus. That has to be the first focus. I don't know how you fix that problem without doing something about yields. You will point out that doing something about yields will not fix that problem, and we'll agree. It's not enough, but it's an absolute prerequisite. All right, the second part. So remind me again.
Yeah, the first part is, it's a value judgment about what harm
Right,
is better
exactly.
to,
Which harm is it?
yeah.
Yeah, I am saying that you are you're kind of accusing me of saying that the eating of the earth is the worst environmental problem of agriculture, and I'll plead guilty to that too. Yeah.
Cool. But the second was that you kind of end up holding the bag for big ag by being trapped in this argument.
And there, this is tough. I mean, it's sort of like, when you support capitalism, does that mean you support, the big companies that are doing a lot of capitalism? It's true. It's like, there are a lot of efficiencies and a lot of advantages to big ag, and they have a lot of political power as well, which makes, and I'm not sticking my head in the sand and saying that it's just a pure coincidence that there's no regulation of these factory farms that are dumping their poop in the river. I'm saying that's something that has to be fought. Look, I think it's kind of unrealistic to just say like, oh, we're just gonna like the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, which has kind of suggested that if we just spend $4 trillion, which surely somebody has in their couch cushion somewhere, we can just have this global transition to agroecology that would get rid of big ag and industrial ag, and extractive ag. And yeah, I don't really think that's like a very realistic way of looking at the world. I do think, there's a reason that 99% of our meat in the United States is factory farmed. In the same way, there's a reason that most of our toys are factory manufactured as opposed to made by hand. There are these economies of scale and automation that industry has been, like I get why ag has gotten big, and I get why people are upset about it, and I agree that that's a hard trend to reverse. What I would say, my kind of I don't know to like if now to get back into the nuts and bolts of policy, I think we need to push back against big ag, not against their bigness or their productivity necessarily, except insofar as they're, anti-competitive. We need to push back against their mess, against their environment, the environmental damage that they're causing. And I think it's not necessarily true that big ag necessarily causes more industrial, more environmental harm than small ag. And I'm not just talking about, in eating the earth terms. I mean, even in, pollution terms. But that said, I think there needs to be a real effort to treat agriculture like any other business. And that applies to big business as well as small business.
Yeah, I think some of that is fair. I think the challenge here is when you do a lot of work to equate, and it's not just you, to equate sustainability with intensification, that just creates this incredible shield for those whose only goal, right, is just to produce for profit, or at least their primary
Well,
goal.
I think, let me just say, because I think in some ways that's a fair critique, because what you are saying is that my emphasis on yield is something that JBS and Tyson and Archer Daniels Midland like too. And that is true. I kind of can't help that. I'm still saying like, hey, we need to be much tougher on JBS and Archer Daniels Midland and and Tyson Foods and they should not be running the show at COP. The fact that they are more efficient and that can have good secondhand effects on the planet or less bad secondhand effects on the planet than inefficient agriculture does not give them a pass for their environmental harms. But it is true that I'm sure, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of bad actors in big ag who find it comforting that I'm defending, sort of at least their productivity. And you know, it's I guess it's a little bit like that onion meme about the worst person just made the best point. You know?
Well, in this similar vein, I want to talk about Denmark, which I think I'll be a little bit more vulnerable, and you can score some points here, right? So in the book here, you kind of frame the green tripartite agreement in Denmark as kind of a model solution, and I found some kind of interesting reporting that you had in there because I'm speculating a little bit. You know more because of your reporting here, but I've been following the case. And this agreement is an agreement saying, hey, let's bring together different sectors of the Danish economy and stakeholders to figure out what we're going to do with agriculture's impact, and we'll hash it out, in talks, and then that will create legitimacy for a future kind of new agriculture environmental policy. And against all odds, it comes through. But in the book, right, according to your writing, it's the agricultural lobby in Denmark that approaches the World Resources Institute in searching here to kind of effectively defang a potential sea change in the structure of production, where livestock production, intensive production, is really kind of getting pointed out as a key driver of environmental harm. And so, if you look at some of the reporting in Denmark about the agreement, those who saw a chance for a paradigm shift, they were sidelined. They felt like they couldn't get their wishes of agroecology to feature in the new agreement, and they felt betrayed by these policies. So, you see some of the policies, and WRI wrote a report about it as the future thing to do. And, I see it as something dangerous, a classic case where sustainable intensification allows the agricultural lobby to keep doing what it's doing. So where does our difference come here
Yeah,
from?
I mean, I saw Greenpeace has been upset, but most environmental groups ended up endorsing the tripartite agreement. And like and the fact that it's tripartite also suggests that it was supported, throughout the political spectrum in Denmark, which has become a little broader than those of us who, have our caricatures of Denmark might expect. And yeah, this is one where I think, it is kind of the Mike Grunwald Agricultural Reform Act of 2025, because what the Greenpeace was pushing for was essentially their bottom line was we want fewer pigs, we want fewer cows, we want our old Denmark back, we want less poop. The fact is, if, Denmark has, I think it was the most efficient dairy industry in the world and the third most efficient pork industry in the world. And if you just say what the enviros wanted, which was just like only use half as many cows and half as many pigs, all you would be doing is outsourcing your pork and dairy production to less efficient countries abroad and outsourcing your emissions, outsourcing your deforestation. Well, what they did in Denmark is really, I think, kind of a best case scenario. Where, first of all, I should say it only happened because they've done such a great job decarbonizing the rest of their economy, where suddenly ag was this huge outlier where other businesses were kind of like, how come we have to clean up our mess, but agriculture doesn't? They're going to be half of our emissions, and they're only like 1 or 2% of the economy. So ag, as you suggested, ag did have to come to the table, and they had to come up with a plan of their own. But, the plan that Tim helped them devise back in I remember I went in 2020, so it was right before COVID hit, in I think February 2020, and he had this crazy idea that like, "No, you should go ahead, you should make even more food, but the government should force you to do it with less mess, with less nitrogen pollution. You have to do a better job, managing your manure. And also, the government should use you as like a global experiment to test the kind of innovations like feed additives that will help your cattle burp less methane, or gene edited feed crops that will have higher yields and use less fertilizer and be more resilient in a warming world. And at the same time, after you make more food with less land, we're going to take 1 million acres of your land and return it to nature, which is going to be a huge environmental victory. And at the same time, we're going to promote plant based eating. We're going to invest in alternative proteins that will help reduce Denmark's impact on global demand for meat. And we're going to tax agricultural emissions. So we're going to do all the things. The one thing we're not going to do is just say, like, hey, you can't do high efficiency meat production anymore because meat is bad. It did acknowledge that, like, there is global demand for meat. If it's going to be produced, it ought to be produced in an efficient place like Denmark. So yeah, I think it's like a win-win. It's going to be a laboratory for the world. I expect real innovations to come out of their experiments. And I also expect 1 million acres of their farmland, which is like, I think it was like a sixth of their farmland, to be returned to nature, which is something that environmentalists in Denmark have been clamoring for.
Yeah, I think let's clip this so we can watch this as it goes, right? I think the worry there from a kind of biodiversity perspective is that when you are pairing industrial production next to your land that you are supposed to then be sparing, the biodiversity doesn't respect those boundaries, and so you actually reduce the quality of the environmental land that you have in between, right? So I think yeah, I think this is kind of shows some of my worldview that it's that the politics of compromise there, may have prevented a grander structural change, which is clear from what I've learned from this conversation. You're kind of thinking through, what's pragmatic, what can be done, especially given the urgency. I want to not to continue on the antagonistic questions. I think what you've been doing with writing about kind of equating the Maha movement and naturalistic reach for good farming narratives in a romanticized way has been clever. I think, from an academic's perspective, the critique of the good food movement is fairly known, but you have told me that you offended Alice Waters at a Berkeley event. I've also written skeptically about Chez Panisse. So why do we agree here? What's the problem here in your view, and what should be done?
I don't know exactly why Alice Waters was glaring daggers at me during my entire debate with an agroecology professor from Berkeley. Um, but I assume it's that she just doesn't like this idea that her, $300 a plate meal that's, grown in glorified gardens is not really a climate solution or an environmental solution, that it's in fact just a kind of indulgent luxury good that is actually coming at the expense of forests and grasslands, and that she is certainly one of those people who believe that food should be more expensive, that would be a good thing, and I just don't think that is true. I would like to see more production, lower prices, more accessibility, and more affordability.
Yeah, I mean, I think where we might disagree here is I think that gastronomy is an important piece of a food system solution, right? It matters not just what is grown, is the yields, kind of like what are yields? What are you measuring here? But who is being nourished? How are they being nourished? Can people's cultural relations to food be maintained through whatever kind of sustainability solution? And I think from kind of the local good food movement, I think if I think you probably agree that if you go to visit these farms, they are really nice places to be, and the food is delicious. And I think that the practices that some of these farmers use are important, lighthouses for what could be done elsewhere. But I think the theory of change through kind of elite to elite consumption and production cycles, I don't think that's especially, under the urgency of some of these climate and social problems, that's going to be what's going to do it for us.
I think that's true, but now, I hate, maybe I should just, like, we should just join arms and agree that on this I'm not a useful idiot. But I actually do want to, like, point out that I do like some of these farms, and they're great. And one of the reasons they're great is that they're often growing a lot of vegetables and a lot of fruit. Which is really cool because I think we need more fruit and vegetable production. Although I will say, like, I live in Florida where we have kind of industrial fruit and vegetable production, and that makes healthy food too. It makes it with like a lot of pesticides and a lot of nastiness. And, I wrote a book about the Everglades where, some of these guys have been a real menace. But what I will say, and this is where I've gotten often crosswise with Maha people, is that I think the good food movement generally, and really, I think just sort of people tend to overstate the connection between how food is grown and how healthy and nutritious it is. Like, a soybean can be an edamame, or it can be fed to a, chicken and become like a, a Chick-fil-A crispy chicken sandwich, right? Um, it can be Twinkies, it can be, it can be anything. And I think there are a lot of people's complaints with the industrial food system and ultra processed foods and things like that are actually somewhat, kind of disconnected from the question of how this stuff is grown. I mean, just because like a lot of, organic farms, they send their stuff to the farmer's market, and people assume that, that kind of stuff is generally healthier. And what's healthier is like fruits and vegetables are healthier. Not taking in more calories than you burn is healthier. Um, and, not eating too much sugar is healthier, and not eating too much red meat is healthier. It is true that we eat a lot of shit in the United States, and a lot of it is grown industrially, but it's not shit because it's grown industrially. It's just shit because it's shit.
The health and production style is too linked, right? I think that's where we agree. But I think we should question why those shit products are being made and who gets to decide. So one of the themes of the book that comes out a lot is that you have this faith in the wizards, or the technological advances, that they're more rational and useful than the prophets. I did notice reading the book that it spends a lot of time in the corner of long shot techno fixes that you like appear to be failing time and time again. But explain your belief in the wizard theory of change, and kind of how do you square that with the struggling nature of the food techno fixes that you chronicle in your book?
I like profits too. Remember, like I said, my first book was about the Everglades. It's like I'm a nature guy. I do, and like you said, I don't think I'm like Panglossian about technology. I write about all kinds of big technological ideas that are struggling in the marketplace and are just, and in some ways the kind of like, I guess you're the sort of belief in organic farming and agroecology, in a way that sort of tends to be lumped in with profits in the kind of wizard and the profit makeup. But in a way, like, those are technologies too. And in fact, in Brazil, I wrote about how some of them are working really well, particularly on the pasture, sort of regenerative intensification side. What I will say, and it is true, is that I think as a species, we're not awesome at making great sacrifices, for future generations and the health of the planet, but we are really good at inventing stuff. So I do think that to the extent that we can, come up with, whether it's, new technologies or even new practices that allow us to make more food with less fertilizer, or at least less fertilizer waste, or, make more beef with less land and less methane emissions. I do think those are the kinds of problems that humans are good at solving. But as you say, you know, most we haven't solved them yet, and I don't pretend that we have.
Yeah, I think if you want to view politics as a technology, right, then the breakdown between wizards and prophets just becomes a lot more fluid. But kind of on that point about agroecology, let's assume for a moment that the flawed land sparing model is correct, and that yields should be the alpha dog of sustainable food. Given that we have good empirics, today that agroecological methods can be competitive with industrial monocultures purely in terms of yields, not about any of the other additional benefits that we might care about. But they control vastly less, control over land and capital. Why won't you go long for agroecology as you do these other technologies? Like, what's the difference between
Oh, I do.
agroecological R&D? Like you do, and so
Mm.
like, but then why do you say that this 4 trillion investment is not a good idea? I was so surprised to read like the amount of money being thrown into the cell ag in the book. Just startling. It was like again and again. You were just listing all the investment figures.
Well, actually, actually, this is a good, like, no, I don't think it's startling. It's like we've invested $3 billion in cell ag in its entire history. There was like $500 billion invested in solar last year. I mean, these are and I think cell ag is like a really exciting technology that can, you know, that can help solve or at least, really chip away a big, a lot of these problems over time. I would like to see much more investment in that. I also agree that there should be investment in, organic and regenerative, technologies to help, and practices to help with a focus on yield. I think that's great. And I think you're seeing Brazil, they're starting to do quite a bit of that.
Guess just kind of one final point on this is if you're trying to evaluate potential winners here and you're an investor and you've got one that have had this head start and you have this other which has vastly overperformed but doesn't have as much resources, that seems like the clearer one that you might want to bet on.
Which is what how has, I mean, agroecology has been around for, I don't know, 12,000 years, right? Um,
Yeah, but the amount of investment in agroecological practices, the amount of land that is controlled by farmers doing it, and the ability to come close into yields or sometimes exceed yields based on, some of these exemplars. It sounds like if you have a model that can produce in situ biodiversity and, get close to the yields that you think is very important, right? That seems like even under the land sparing logic, a clear investment target.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that's not where they're getting their $4 trillion. I mean, these are like we were talking about like many, many orders of magnitudes different. And this is why Tim's line about how we need to hurry the fuck up and figure shit out. I think that's absolute. I would absolutely apply that to regenerative and organic systems as well. I 100% agree. Yeah, I think we should be on the research side. We should be treating this as like a five-alarm fire on every piece of the agricultural system. It's just that, but that's when they talk about spending $4 trillion to transform global agriculture, they're not talking about research.
How do they transform global agriculture with money?
I mean, I think this is like, paying just buying out the bad guys and backing out the bad guys, and that's the Rockefeller Foundation thing is basically just like, paying farmers to do this stuff. It's not like a research plan.
You have been doing a bunch of interviews after your book. Who has surprised you? Who's changed your mind? Who has added something to what you think is an interesting way to think about this problem?
Well, one, this hasn't changed my mind, but it's certainly a point of emphasis, and you raised it, is this idea, like, when the book first came out, there was a lot of pushback from people, from foodies, from hippies, from regenerative and organic types saying, like, basically low yield agriculture is better. Productive production sucks. As you've seen, I push back against that pretty hard. But I have started to hear more of this idea that, like, hey, regenerative and organic can have high yields too. How come there isn't more investment in the research and development side for those kinds of approaches to agriculture? And as I said, like, that's a good point. It's like I'm with you on that. And to the extent that we've overinvested in big ag's yield research and underinvested in regenerative ag's yield research, I think that's a really good point that I talked about some in the potential of regenerative practices to create kick-ass yields in Brazil in the book, but it's something that I'm now thinking about and emphasizing more.
I want to end by making a pitch for your next book.
My wife's gonna kill you.
Or your next article, right? The best part of your book for me is how you bring to life these different solutions. So you have reporting skills. You're writing in an accessible way, right? You're bringing this big picture idea that agriculture is really important for the climate to the fore. I think that's great. You also have a background in political reporting, and that last line in your book is "Every acre is sacred." I felt kind of reading through your book, like if you read between the lines, every time Searchinger comes up against trying to get what he believes is right, it's the role of politics on land use change is everywhere, not just indirect land use change, but the way politics shape how land get used. What do you think about a story about the politics that shape what happens on the land and not just the economics? Who would you call instead of Searchinger? How would you tell the story? And does that interest you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you saw it, but like, couple months ago, I did 2 New York Times columns in the last few months in different ways, like, banging my spoon in my high chair about the way the United States government treats agriculture. One of them was specifically, I think the headline was Democrats should stop pandering to farmers. And it was about how there's this traditional deal where Democrats would support these absurd corporate welfare farm subsidies for the biggest farmers, turn a blind eye to their environmental messes. And in exchange, Republicans would support food stamps. Remember, there used to be a fair amount of rural Democrats too. But now, of course, there aren't, and Republicans have turned their back on the food stamp part of the situation. So I'm saying this is an awesome time for to actually let's have this fight and to start thinking about and this I'm talking about U.S. politics, but instead of having both parties focused on the 2 million farmers in America, how about have one party that cares more about the 350 million eaters? And right now you look at the stuff Trump is doing, it's an awesome opportunity for a party that was willing to piss off some big farmers, but you would be, against tariffs, you'd be against cracking down on migrant, farm workers. You'd be against biofuel mandates. These are all things that increase the price of food. You'd be against the U.S. sugar program, right? And all those other, the way crop insurance is done, and some of the price loss replacement programs that all basically put a floor under food prices. So I think like there are opportunities, especially now that affordability generally and food affordability in particular has become such a potent political issue. I've definitely been pushing on this idea that like this is a great opportunity to rethink the politics of this stuff. It'll be hard, but everything I write about is hard.
I think it's a great place to end. Mike Grunwald, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Landscapes. Thanks for listening. Thanks again to Michael Grunwald for suggesting the idea for the episode and spending a lot of time recording. You can find links to some of the arguments and evidence that we discussed in the show notes. You can find a written transcript of the entire episode at adamcalo.substack.com, where you can also get in touch. I'd love to hear your feedback.